Today, we're going to dig into one of the biggest turning points in human history, the agricultural revolution. But here's the thing. We're going to challenge that story of glorious progress you've always heard. What if the decision to start farming wasn't our greatest achievement, but actually a massive trap? Let's get into it.
So the story we all know goes something like this, right? For thousands and thousands of years, we were just wandering around, foraging for food. Then boom, about 10,000 years ago, we figured out farming. And that led to food surpluses, permanent villages, and eventually the whole shebang. Cities, writing, art, civilization. It's always presented as the moment we finally conquered nature and started climbing the ladder of progress.
But what if that's not the whole picture? What if, for the average person living through it, this great leap forward felt more like a great fall? In this explainer, we're going to unpack the pretty shocking argument that for most of humanity, ditching the hunter-gatherer life for agriculture might have been the worst mistake we ever made.
To really get our heads around this, we have to stop thinking in terms of grand civilizations and zoom all the way in to the daily life of one person. So let's compare the life of a forager with the life of one of these very first farmers and ask yourself, would you have actually made that trade?
Well, the difference in their day-to-day was just huge. On one hand, you've got hunter-gatherers. They ate a super varied diet, nuts, berries, different kinds of wild game, and because they were always on the move, they literally walked away from their own garbage and, well, a lot of diseases. But on the other hand, these new farmers? They became totally dependent on just a few starchy crops and lived crammed together in permanent villages. It was a brand new and, frankly, a much more dangerous way to live.
Yeah, this new agricultural life was built on a really narrow foundation. It was all about a handful of cereal grains. Now, these crops were a game changer because you could store them, which is huge. But nutritionally, they were a serious downgrade from a forager's diet. So you ended up with a food supply that was not only less healthy, but ironically, a lot more fragile. And it wasn't just the food. Nope. The simple act of settling down, of staying in one place, had some really profound and deadly consequences. You get a bunch of people, their domesticated animals, and all their waste piling up. Well, you've just created an environment that never existed before, and it turned out to be an absolute paradise for germs.
This quote from the historian James C. Scott absolutely nails it. He calls the early settlement the domus, and he describes it as a feedlot, and not just for people and animals, but for a whole ecosystem of pests and parasites, from rats all the way down to fleas, lice, and bacteria that basically evolved to live with us and on us.
So here's the key takeaway. For our foraging ancestors, if a camp got dirty or a sickness broke out, the solution was easy. You just move. You literally leave your parasites in the dust. But farmers, tied to their fields, tied to their grain stores, they couldn't go anywhere. They had to live with their own filth. And this is where humanity got its first brutal taste of epidemics. Okay, so you'd think, right, that the whole point of farming was to get a stable, overflowing food supply. The dream must have been more food, less work, more time to chill. But the reality? It was the exact opposite. Farming created this vicious cycle that some call the labor trap. And this shows you exactly how it worked. It's a feedback loop. Farming gives you more food. That leads to a population boom. But now you have way more mouths to feed, which means you have to work even harder, clear more land, dig more irrigation ditches, just to break even. It was a one-way street, and there was no turning back.
And the numbers here are just staggering. Farming could support a much, much higher population density, sometimes 10 times more people in the same amount of space. Once you have that many people, going back to the old foraging lifestyle, it's just not an option anymore. The land can't support you. The gate had just slammed shut behind them.
So this new situation, a whole bunch of people stuck in one place, depending on a food source that you can easily store and, more importantly, tax. It didn't just create problems with disease and work. It also created a massive political opportunity. It made the rise of the state not just possible, but maybe inevitable.
You see, this new Neolithic agro-complex was the essential ingredient for any early state. Sure, you could have farming without a state, but you could never, ever have a state without a large population of grain farmers. And why is that? Because that population could be, well, effectively milked for its resources.
So what was so special about grain for a would-be king? Well, think about it. It ripens all at once, it's easy to see and count in the field, and you can divide it, store it, and move it around. That makes it the perfect thing to tax. Plus, your population is now all in one place, making them easy to conscript into an army that you can feed with that very same grain. For the first time ever, a population became legible, easy for a ruler to read and control.
So all this extra grain they were growing, where did it go? Did it make the farmers' lives better? Not a chance. Instead, it went to feed a whole new class of people who never touched a plow. Rulers, priests, soldiers, bureaucrats. This is it. This is the origin of deep, structural social inequality. The pyramid of civilization was built right on the backs of these farmers.
And if you ever wonder what these new states really cared about, just look at their symbols. In ancient Sumer, the symbol of being a king was the rod and line, basically a surveyor's toolkit. That tells you everything, doesn't it? The state's main business wasn't justice or well-being, it was measuring, assessing, and taking resources from its people.
So, you put it all together. The disease, the endless treadmill of labor, and the rise of a controlling state that takes all your surplus. You can see how this wasn't really a revolution of progress. It was a trap, a one-way gate in human history that once you walked through it, you couldn't go back.
And believe it or not, the trap just kept getting tighter. By putting all their eggs in one basket, relying on just a few crops, these entire societies became incredibly vulnerable. One bad drought, one flood, one new crop disease, and your entire food supply could be wiped out. This created the first large-scale famines, a type of horror that our more flexible foraging ancestors rarely, if ever, had to face.
Just think about one of the most basic freedoms they lost. If a foraging group had a conflict or if the local nuts and berries ran low, what did they do? They moved. They could just walk away from their problems.
But farmers were stuck. They were tethered to their land, to their houses, to their precious stores of grain, and that made them stationary targets. Targets for drought, targets for disease, targets for raiders who wanted their grain, and, of course, targets for the state tax collector.
Look, at the end of the day, the modern world we live in, with its incredible cities and technologies and billions of people, it was only possible because of this agrarian foundation. But we have to remember, it's a foundation that was built on a bed of disease, inequality, and state control. And that leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. If our ancestors walked right into a trap that promised an easier life but delivered hardship, what seemingly great systems are we building today that might turn out to be one-way gates of their own?